Hey everybody, I wanted to create a video on macros in Excel, but I specifically wanted to talk about something that helped my career and helped me a lot. And it's a very powerful concept, and it's one of a loop. And I think if I kind of give you the business case that I had, so right out of college, I ended up working in corporate retail, and I was working in pricing specifically. So there's a few hundred stores that we had to do pricing for, and we were kind of doing that at the corporate level, and we would maintain these pricing reports, and we would kind of save them in these folders, kind of a thing. But we didn't necessarily have one repository where we were saving the total count of all price changes, or certain pieces of information from those reports. And one day late in the year, some executive in the company decided that they wanted to know how many price changes took place, for the full year to date. And, we had everything to be able to give that answer, but it involved, basically just manually going through a folder and opening just hundreds and hundreds of these Excel pricing reports that were, going to contain all that information. And my back of the envelope kind of estimation was that it was going to take between 40 to 50 manual hours of just opening the folders and literally copying out information and pasting it into just a master file, which felt like, a really horrible use of time. And so I really didn't know anything about how to specifically do that faster, but it did feel like there could be a better way. So I started, going to Google, trying to figure out, what could be done. And I came across this idea of loops. And this was something that was really powerful. And ultimately, I was able to write this code, between learning it and actually writing it. It took maybe 3 or 4 hours, but then it saved that 40 to 50 hours, which was something that our team was really excited about. I mean, it made us more efficient, and it let us work on something that was going to be, more value add, or going to add more value than, simply just doing this really rote manual task. But not only that, but it was something that, so that was back in 2012, and I've been with a few different companies since then, and that's something that I've been able to bring to each company after that. I mean, not only has it been something that in job interviews so far I've been able to bring up that example, the very first example, to say that, hey, there was a process that was going to take 50 hours, and I wrote code that once the code was actually complete, I was able to hit a button, and that was done in 5 seconds instead of 50 hours. That's a powerful thing to be able to say. But again, that looping structure that I was talking about, being as powerful as it is something that I was able to carry on to other jobs. So I want to kind of show you how you would do this in practice. And I mean, it is a slightly advanced concept. It does involve being able to write a little bit of your own VBA. The good news is that I got to say that I was one of those people starting out. I definitely, didn't have a coding background. I think that most of the code that I would see, it was generally something that I would almost label as magic. It was just something that I didn't really think that I was going to be able to understand, let alone be able to actually write and implement. So if if so far you think that, hey, this could be something that I really want to learn, but maybe you think it's going to be too difficult, I would just really encourage you to say, as somebody who's been there, that you definitely can learn this. And I'm going to do my best to kind of walk you through, really clearly how we can go about doing this, but also really kind of show, what we can change or where we could potentially be going wrong with this, because I think that's really important. It's, sometimes really easy when you're listening to somebody give you, step-by-step instructions, but then when you're on your own, you're like, oh, wait a minute, now that I'm at this step, maybe you forgot a certain letter, maybe you forgot a certain file path or how to find that. It can be kind of hard to figure that out. So I want to be able to equip you with the tools to make you successful in that process. So because this does involve macros, the very first thing that you're going to do is need to make sure that you actually have your developer tab enabled when you have Excel open. So I already have this enabled, but I'm going to actually go in and, set this back to the default setting and then turn it back on, just to be able to make sure that you guys can understand how you can actually go about doing this. So to be able to hide this or to add it back, we're going to go over here to File, And we're going to scroll down to options. And there's a section towards the bottom called customize a ribbon. We're going to click into that. And on the right side, there's a box here for main tabs. And there's one for developer. And if we simply just left click the developer box there, it's going to uncheck it, hit OK. We see that goes away. And it brings down our recording. But we want it there. So to get it back, it's really that simple. You go back, same process, down to options, customize ribbon, and click the little box next to developer, and then our box is back. So if we click into developer, this is going to be able to kind of show us where we can, create macros, run macros, record macros, kind of all that functionality. Most of that the key things that we're going to be doing with macros is off to the left here. So we've got our Visual Basic, which we can kind of dive into the, kind of more advanced code from what we're doing. There's also a box for macros here, which any macros that you actually have saved will be able to be accessible here. And you can say if it's all open workbooks, your personal workbook, you can kind of figure out where those are saved to be able to kind of narrow that down a little bit. So when you're first starting out, by the way, those are going to be completely blank for you. So that is that piece. Now, if you are just starting out, there's and I want to really kind of talk about the power of, the looping function and what this can do. But, to give a little bit of primer on macros, you're able to save a macro in an individual Excel workbook. You can absolutely do that. Like if I wanted to save this file as book 1 and I save it with a macro to do something, I can have it set up where that is only accessible in this workbook and it's not going to be accessible anywhere else. So if I send it to somebody else, or if I, email it, share it with somebody else, they'd be able to access it in that workbook, and that can be great. But, there's also something else we can do. Like if there's a macro that you're going to be using a lot, if you're going to be using something to format something, if you're, just a macro that you want to be able to use basically in any Excel workbook that you're going to be using, you can save it to your personal workbook. And your personal workbook is actually not going to be available by default. So in order to get that, what you would have to do is you can just literally record any macro. So we're going to come up here to record macro, and it's going to ask you where you want to store it. We're going to want to say personal macro workbook, and we're going to want to save it in there because just the process of actually recording a macro and saving it to your personal macro workbook is actually going to create that personal workbook for you. So I'll just kind of show you what that looks like. We can call it test macro, hit OK. And again, when you're usually doing a macro, you can do something in here. I don't really care about doing that. I just want to be able to, save something. So as soon as you hit record, after you made sure that you actually are saving it to your personal workbook, you can hit stop recording. And then it's created. Now, if you want to see what that looks like, you can actually come here to your macros, and we see that we do have that test macro that we just created here. Now, if you wanted to just run it, you could click there, hit run. But you can also go into your Visual Basic and see a little bit more about what's going on. And we're going to come over here to where we see at the top, these are the macros that could be saved in your book 1, but these are the macros that are saved in your personal workbook. They're going to be accessible in any Excel file that you have open on your computer. So whenever you record a new macro, it's always going to automatically create a new module. So before I did that, I had 3 modules. It created a 4th module. I'm going to double left click into that. And then this is the contents of my test macro. And you can see that there's really nothing going on. I clicked on cell C5 and that's all I did, right? So not a lot of meat to this, but it would serve the purpose if you didn't already have a personal workbook to create that. So that's kind of how that piece goes. But, now I want to kind of show you the looping kind of functionality of this. So what I have done, let's go over here. I've already created a test folder, and I put this in Excel better, and I created just a test, and I have 3 files here. So test 1, test 2, test 3. And these are just blank files right now. Like if I open test 1, here we go, it's just a blank file. So I'm going to close that. Now, the question could be, what if I, and again, in this case, there's 3 files. What if there were 300 files? What if there are 30 files? Imagine that there's something that you're doing where there are multiple files within a folder where you need some work done to them. And imagine that, you want, that work to be done automatically without you needing to go in and open all of the files up. Well, allowing us to kind of loop through those is going to allow us to do that. So I already have one of these kind of put together here. I'm going to delete this out. We're going to come back to this later. But when we're actually in our, personal workbook here, if you click at the end of your sub and you use F8, it will actually kind of step through each line of the code, and you can see that it's highlighted in yellow, and that's where you're at. So I'm going to keep hitting F8 to just kind of go through the lines of this just to show you what it's doing, and then we'll go back and kind of explain more of what's happening here. So right here we can see that there was like a little flicker on the screen because this is actually opening a workbook. So if I come hover over my little Excel icon down here, I see that there's a workbook now open called test 1. Okay. I'm going to go back and I'm going to keep using F8. I'm going to iterate through. It's going to come down to loop. It's going to push this back to the top and it's going to open another file. And now workbook test 2 is open. And if we do it one more time, we see that workbook test 3 is open. So that's kind of what's going on there. And the idea would be, again, that you're not just opening and closing the workbooks, but you could imagine that maybe there's something that you actually want to be doing to those workbooks. So let me show you a quick example. Again, each of those workbooks, as we kind of talked about, let's open one here. So that test 1, it's completely blank right now. Let's close test 3. So those workbooks are blank, but what if we want something in there? And again, just to kind of illustrate what that could look like, just a silly example. Let's just say that cell A1, we wanted to say add some stuff to this file. Now, you can drop in whatever kind of code you have here. You could record a macro. This could be, formatting that you always have to do to files, and then maybe it's the same formatting you do for 30 different files. It can be, kind of things of that nature. But whatever code you want to have happen, we can just go ahead and drop that in. I'm going to come back here. If I hit run, now let's go open one of these test files again. And we see that test 1 has add some stuff to this file. We're going to close out of that. Come over here. We're going to see that test 2 has add some stuff to this file. Not very relevant, but again, I'm trying to show you that this is done very quickly. There could have been 30 different workbooks in this. 30, 300, 3,000, whatever the number is, it would actually just automatically loop through and do that piece that we're trying to do to it. So now that I've kind of shown you a little bit more, about, some of the actual ways that works, I want to walk through the code, and then we can kind of walk through recreating the code together to kind of write that out. But, the very first step is that, there's this path that we have to figure out. So the path is where the actual file is saved at, or the folder to where these are actually saved at. So if you remember, I said, hey, there's an Excel Better folder, and within an Excel Better folder, there's another folder called test. So, and that's where all of these files reside. So when this is saying path, this is saying, hey, exactly where this is saved on my computer, this is the exact folder where all of the files I'm looking at are pointed at. And I'm calling this path, and I feel like this is important to realize, is that this is just a variable name that I'm assigning. This could, within reason, kind of be called anything else that you want to. And I say within reason because there's other kind of like, there are some, keywords in Excel that are Excel VBA that are off limits. So sometimes, like if you're going to call it, loop, or you're going to call it different things that could be, used in other places, it might not like that. But, one of the great things about Excel, from a coding perspective and just generally when you're working just with a normal workbook without code, is that you get to realize pretty much instantly if what you're trying to do is working or not working, right? So if you try to run the code and there's an error and it says, loop equals this and that line's doing that, that gives you some sense of, okay, something's wrong with this line. And maybe you start to say, okay, is it the fact that I'm calling this loop equals? Is that my variable name is wrong? You could change the variable name to something like, just anything else, right? You could call it, like if path didn't work, you could say, path name, right? You're just not allowed to have spaces there. So it's either got to be continuous or you got to have an underscore. So in this case, I'm calling it path, but I don't need to be calling it path. But it is important to realize that because I'm calling this a variable, and I'm going to be referencing this at different points in the code down below, that if I change what I want to call this, I've got to change it in every other place that my code exists. So good to keep that in mind. So the other thing with this is right off the bat, you might be wondering, okay, but how would I actually know where to get this path, right? Like that's fantastic. I don't know off the top of my head that my file is actually saved in C users and in SIG and documents in Excel Better. And in fact, even like I'll tell you in my case, if I go to documents and I go to Excel Better, it's not obvious, from this view that that's actually where it's saved. Like it'll say this PC, documents, Excel Better, but that looks different than C users in SIG, documents, Excel Better, right? That looks different. But what you can do, and I know that there are multiple ways you can go about getting this information, but you can actually use something with Excel VBA to get that information for you as well. You can use this simple code in a workbook that's actually open and activated. If you run this code, it'll actually put the full name of the active workbook in cell A1. So let's kind of do that with one of our test files here. So if I open up test 1, so right now I don't have to delete this out because this is an A1 and it's going to automatically overwrite it. So right now it says add some stuff to this file. If I go back to my code, if I run this, and again, this is very key because this is saying application.activeworkbook.fullname. The key part of this is that, it's saying active workbook. So if I want this to work for test 1, I have to make sure that the workbook I'm clicking into here is the workbook that I want, that VBA to be working for in this case. So like if I was in book 1 and I ran this code, I'm gonna come up here. There's kind of this little play button. It says run. I'm gonna left click that. If that works, now it just says book 1. And that's because book 1 is this workbook that I have open. And it's a workbook that isn't saved, so it's not telling me any information about where it's saved because it's simply not saved. So this didn't do us a lot of good. So again, we'll kind of want to keep this in mind that this is something where you could go wrong thinking about, oh, I'm going to run this code, try to figure out where my file is saved. It didn't work. It's just saying book 1. That's because you're running this against a file that's active, that is not saved, and not the file that you actually want to be using. But alternatively, if we make sure that we're clicked into test 1 and we go back to the code, come up to that little play button, left click that, then we see that we actually get the file path, including the full file name. Now, I'm not interested in copying the actual file of it because I just want to know where it actually lives. So I know as soon as everything after the backsplash there is not something that I want to be copying over. So I'm going to take everything before the file name, highlight that, Control C, and that's something that I could just literally drop right in there as it already was. So that's how we're going to get our path. Now this is only going to change if you actually change where you're saving your file. If you decide that, I don't really want to be saving this in a test folder, I want to be, saving this in a folder called live, you can absolutely do that. you just would have to come over here and say, hey, I no longer want it pointed at test. I'm going live with this code. I believe in it now. I know it's going to work. This is where my files live. You would just change that test piece to live. But we're going to continue with test the way it is. The next variable that we're going to be defining is going to be the actual file type. So in this case, we're working with Excel documents. Specifically, I'm using Excel 2019, so I'm going to be using XLSX. And so what this is doing, it's saying I'm going to call this variable file type, and I'm saying it's equal to XLSX. Now, we're putting this in quotes because we're saying that essentially, in quotes, this wildcard says any file that any information that precedes it is kind of like what this wildcard is doing here, is saying as long as it's followed by XLSX, we want that, right? So that's all the files that we're going to be using. And this can come in handy, like if you have, essentially a folder full of, notepad files. You can figure out what kind of, notepad that is. If it's a PRN file or a text file, you can use that extension or file type to be able to open those particular files. Or if it's a Word file, you'd be able to actually open Word files and kind of loop through in the same way. So that's kind of what this file type can be used for. And again, we can call this file type whatever we want within reason. Just can't use spaces and can't use other kind of words that are going to be used by default for Excel for other things. And then finally, we want to define files here, or kind of file. You could call this file name. We want to define this as dir, or dir, and then open parenthesis path and file type. And you remember, so we're already looking at here, this is using our variable path that we created here. This is using our file type that we're using here. So it's combining those. And what this dir, or kind of like directory function, is doing is that, it is saying within a particular folder, it will automatically take the first file that's available to be presented. But if you just use that directory or that dir function and you don't point it to anywhere, it's not going to know what folder, what path, and whatever else that you're starting with. So this is basically just initializing what the first file you want to be using, and it's by default just going to take literally the first one in your folder. Now later on, this is going to be important because this thing, it's going to, for the very first one, it needs to know where to be pointed at. But the next time you use it, once it already knows where it is, if you actually just call it, directory or the dir, and you don't actually specify anything else, it will just automatically go to the next file. And then once that one is closed, it can just automatically go to the next file. So this is part of what makes it really powerful, because it can, again, this is how it's able to open a file, close it, and then automatically know to go to the next one and go to the next one. Okay, so again, we're calling that files, and that's the way that's kind of built there. Now, whenever you have a loop that we're using, and our loop is going to be down here, you're going to kick it off with something like a do while. So this is saying, do while, and this is saying, in this particular case, it's saying do while len, which is meaning the length. So do while the len of files is greater than 0. And it's saying this because as it's looping through, in files is that directory between the file, the path, and the file type. So if the next file exists, that's going to give us a string count. The length of that is actually going to be greater than 0. So in our particular case, we have 3 files. So it's going to open the first one, which it knows where the first one is and what folder and the file type and all those things, because we're defining it here. So that's what initializes it. And then after that, it's going to know that it's going to go to the second file, and then it's going to go look for the third file. And in all those cases, it's going to find them. And then it's going to try to look for a fourth file, but it's going to say, hey, the length of the fourth file that you're trying to find is not greater than 0. So this is saying that this is how it's able to actually also kind of iterate through the whole folder. And while it's not going to just go on forever or just kind of break it, it's going to stop as soon as it realizes that it's finding the last file. So this is saying do while there's actually still files in your folder that exist. And then underneath of that, we're going to let it know that, we don't just want it to find it and identify it, but we want to actually open that. So we're going to say now set, and here's another variable. I'm going to say open file. So set our open file equal to workbooks.open and the path and the files. So that's going to open that. And then here, this is going to be whatever we want to be done with the file. So the meat of what we're kind of really doing with this is going to be put in here. And I'll show some other more powerful examples and things that we can do here to plug this in. And then it's going to say, okay, so that open file.close true, that's just going to be able to close it. And then this files equals dir or directory kind of piece here. That's just the thing where it's saying, okay, now find that next piece. Because again, this dir, after the first time where it's actually pointing to a particular file within the folder, the next time it's used without any kind of, specificity here, it's going to know you just want it to open the next file. So we're saying, hey, make files now, just the next file in there. And then it's going to say loop through that. And again, it's just going to keep doing that for as long as there's actually files in there. Okay, so let's delete this out and let's just take a stab here at recording a macro. And I think that, when you're creating macros, and certainly from my perspective, there's, a few different things that are going on. I think macros are going to be at their, they're going to be the most effective when you're able to kind of combine being able to record a macro with being able to actually edit and kind of write your own macros as well. Because as you're seeing that, we're able to kind of take this looping macro and we can modify this to point it to a different path, and we can modify it based on different file types. So we have some flexibility there. But then you also might say, I format a particular file in a certain way. I want to record that once and just drop it in here and do that for all my other files. So let me show you how to do that. Let's go over here to this file. We're going to go to developer. We're going to go to record macro in the upper left hand corner. We're going to left click this. It's going to ask us where we want to save it. We can call this whatever we want. There's just got to be able to be a space in here. It's got to be a unique name. So let's just say macro example Excel better. Okay, we're going to save this on our personal macro workbook. Let's go ahead and hit OK. And now that we're recording this, what the recording means is that anything that you're kind of, clicking around, so if you're just moving your mouse, it doesn't record that, but it will record things like, like let's say that you want this cell A1 to always be yellow, it would format it in that way. Let's say then that for whatever reason you want, A2 to always be orange, and then you want cell A3 to always be green, and then, let's say that you always want, this to say data, and that not only do you want to say that, but you always want it to be bold and italicized, right? Or just, again, I'm just literally making things up, but this can be, very real to reports that you're actually doing. So if there's something that you're manually doing to multiple reports, just the idea of thinking about, okay, you can kind of standardize that a little bit, put them all into one folder. If they have a similar structure, you could literally kind of do this process once, record this once like we're doing, plug the code from this recording into that looping macro, and it's going to automatically go through and just make all those updates. So let's just assume that this is what we wanted for now, or let's make it a little bit more dramatic. Add a little red there just for flair. Why not? Go back up to the developer, stop recording. Now we're going to go to Visual Basic, and in our personal workbook. I guess maybe did I delete one? Let's see, where's our recording? And actually put it in module 4. So I'm going to be able to just copy this out, and I'm not going to copy the sub piece, and I'm not going to copy the end sub, because those are really kind of letting you know that the macro, when you say sub and end sub, that's for an entire macro, and I don't want this to be the entire macro. I want to be able to take the contents of this macro and put it into another macro. So I'm just literally going to copy that, come back here, and paste that in. So it's pasting it right after the open the file, and then I'm putting in all of that recorded macro, and then I'm saying do all of those things to it. And then, by the way, this thing I'm calling open file, close it, find the next one, loop through, do that again. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to take my test 1, close it, say I want to save. And yeah, let's just kind of prove that for a second. Let's say that, test 3, this is what this looks like. It still says add some stuff to this file. Close that. Let's see. Test 2. Still says the same thing. Click this. Click loop example, which is where I pasted it in actually. Click run on that. Now there should be the desired result. So now if I click onto test 3, we can see that workbook named test 3 had that formatting done to it. I just want to again show that if we took this, copied it, and just literally create a lot of copies here. So now let's open copy 21. There's no formatting. Let's open copy 15. No formatting. Just as we expected, of course. But if we come back over here and we run the loop example, and again, we could run it from here, or as we talked about, we could say we want to run it from here, loop example, click run. Okay, and we have that example, and now let's open some of these. Now we have test 1, copy 20, formatted the way we thought it should be formatted. We have, we can open any one of these. Let's just pick copy 11. We can see at the top, that's what it is. It's formatted the way we want it to be formatted. And what's also exciting about this is that, let's say you made a mistake, and again, it's a silly example just with the colors, and this, again, can be a very real, example for you guys. But let's say that, your boss sees the colors that are used here, and let's say once upon a time before lunch, let's say that they really thought that, this, red box here made a lot of sense, but after they, go out for lunch, they come back and they're like, I was thinking about that red box and I think that was a little too harsh. I think that it should be, a lighter shade of orange. So let's go with that. Let's go ahead and do that color. And now if this was a completely manual process, you might be thinking to yourself, great, now I have this folder of, let's say, how many are here? There are 21. So now you're like, I've got to open all 21 of these, or again, let's make it more dramatic. Let's say there's 200, there's 500. That's a lot of work just for somebody to say that they wanted a lighter color orange versus red. So yeah, you would be able to, record that macro again, make that change, put that part into the code. Okay, so this was kind of the beginning primer on, being able to loop through different folders to be able to do different things with Excel VBA. I 100% realize that Excel VBA is kind of an advanced topic here. This did assume a lot of, kind of going into this that you already had some familiarity with VBA. If on the other hand you didn't, I still try to provide that primer for you. But If you still have questions about how I was able to add the developer tab, if you have questions about being able to record macros or being able to edit and add things to macros or modules or any of those questions, go ahead and drop a comment below, and I'd love to be able to help you out. So thanks a lot, guys.